What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Now that I've reviewed all 13 Halloween movies, I'm going to stop and rank every movie in this franchise from worst to best. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your ranking of the Halloween movies are. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's jump into the list. In dead last by a long shot is Halloween Resurrection. To me, if they ever were to make more Halloween movies, which I'm sure they eventually will, I don't think there's getting any worse than this one. For one thing, this would get moved to the bottom alone for its first 15 minutes, where it undoes the ending of H2o, which actually had one of the more satisfying endings in the series. We find out Michael survived the ending of H2o, they kill off Laurie, and then they switch focus to a brand new set of characters, most of whom I honestly couldn't have cared less about, and it feels like an entirely new movie. Now, the thing is, this has an interesting concept. You have this reality show taking place in Michael's childhood home, Michael's running around, and people think any encounters might actually just be part of a stunt and it's not the real Michael. In theory, that's really cool and it can make for a very unsettling movie, but the execution is just awful. For one thing, the blurry shaky cam showing this video footage of the reality show that we constantly see all throughout the movie, it's really bad and disorienting, and it's so consistent that it makes for a borderline incomprehensible movie because you just don't know what's going on half the time. On top of that, the majority of the acting is pretty cringeworthy. Jamie Lee Curtis in the first few minutes is solid, but again, it's like something out of a totally different movie. And Busta Rhymes, I thought he was enjoyable. I know a lot of people don't particularly like him in this movie, but he gets easily one of my favorite lines in any of the Halloween movies, so there's that at least.
Trick or treat, mother.
I liked him even if it wasn't totally for the right reasons, but everyone else here didn't like them that much, unfortunately, and it didn't help that none of these characters ever came off as even remotely compelling. They felt as surface level and one-dimensional as you can get. And to top it all off, Michael feels so shoehorned into the story here that there are times he'll feel like an afterthought, and as a result, you never truly feel the tension each time he's on screen. Like I said, it feels like a number of elements here were pulled out of a few totally different movies. It's like this was written to just be a generic slasher, and then you just have Michael tacked onto it. It really didn't work for me. It's laughably bad in a lot of areas, and I don't think you'll ever get any worse than this in this franchise. At number 12, Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, the last of the Thorn trilogy, and while I think Resurrection is the worst movie, this easily wins as the most incoherent of all the Halloween movies. Like, Resurrection itself was incoherent, don't get me wrong there, but this tops it. This is easily the most far removed from what I think Halloween is all about. Introducing this storyline about a cult that's behind why Michael is the way he is, and I'm not some sort of Halloween purist or anything. I'm all for movies doing something different. I don't hate on an idea on principle or anything, but the way it's all presented here just did not work at all for me. There's so much going on that it's sometimes impossible to figure out what's going on, and as a result, I found it difficult to really find any sort of dread or tension in any scene. There'd be some exceptions here or there, but that's about it. Plus, similar to the way Laurie's killed off so quickly in Resurrection, the way this quickly does away with the once interesting character of Jamie is something I found frustrating and disrespectful. And I also found the once cool, calm, and collected Loomis to be almost a parody of his former self. I mean, Donald Pleasance does what he can here, but it's just a shame this is how his last outing in the series went. It's nothing like the character we enjoyed following in the first movie. Now, you do have Paul Rudd here in one of his earliest movie roles, and for what it was, he was fine, but that's really about it. Now, I haven't seen the producer's cut of this movie. I know some people say it changes the experience, but for me, I've only seen the original cut, and as of now, really wasn't a fan. Number 11, not far behind that, is Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, the second entry in the Thorn trilogy. And while Halloween 4 brought to us an explosive return to the focus on Michael after Season of the Witch focused on a completely different storyline, Halloween 5 halted any sort of potential momentum the series could have had. For one thing, I just mentioned that in Curse of Michael Myers, Loomis felt more like a parody of how he once was. Well, that began with this movie, where at times, he just comes off like a raving old man who gets in everyone's face in an almost creepy sort of way. On top of that, this also shares an element with the previous two movies on this list, where it takes an interesting character from the movie that just came before it, and then kills them off pretty early on, to focus on someone even more insufferable. Now you have Jamie's foster sister Rachel as the final girl of Halloween 4, who was a really compelling protagonist, and They kill her off here in the first act, with the focus shifting on the much more annoying Tina, which I thought was a terrible decision. And this is actually the last of these movies where I'm bringing this particular criticism up, by the way, but that particular problem led to the 3 movies at the bottom of this list landing where they were. Anyway, that aside, I was never really the biggest fan of the whole telepathic connection storyline between Jamie and Michael, and Jamie becoming a mute. Again, you just take all the intrigue away from someone who was so great in the prior movie, and there was some cool surrealist imagery surrounding the storyline, but the way a lot of it was conveyed came off as corny, on top of the fact that there were some serious moments where the score just did not fit the moment and would severely undercut any of the dramatic stakes. And it was just dull. Probably one of the most boring, roughest watches in the series, and the only reason it didn't rank in dead last is because I was at least able to tell what was going on here, as opposed to the incomprehensible way that the previous 2 movies I mentioned played out. Number 10, the original Halloween 2, and I know this one has a bit of a following as one of the better sequels in this franchise, but I personally did not care for it. Now, it's not terrible, it's actually considerably much more watchable than the last 3 movies I mentioned, but it's very much a mixed bag for me. On one hand, it's nice to see that this takes place right where the first movie left off and give a more definitive ending to this night, which actually makes for a good back-to-back double feature with the first. But at the same time, you also notice that dip in quality immediately. It becomes clear the story of this particular night was not meant to be a 2-movie saga, or at least if it was meant to be, it wasn't totally thought through. It essentially just spins its wheels for an hour and a half, regurgitating a lot of the same talking points as the first in just a few different settings, though now with the gore and the violence cranked all the way up, relying less on atmosphere or eerie chills. And if you like gorier horror movies, then maybe you won't mind this so much, and I get it. There's another entry on this list that I like where it's essentially just that. But to me, this just didn't have any sense of fun to those gorier moments. I found this film to take itself way too seriously, and if that's the tone you're gonna go for, you then need to give your scenes much more emotional weight. But a lot of the kill sequences here don't, because they're all made up of random characters who get introduced for one scene, then immediately die in the next, or in the very same scene. Again, it might not be the biggest deal for some. There are some who just come to these movies to just watch Michael Myers go on a rampage, and they may have a good time with it, so you might find this to be fun. However, for me, I think a good sequel that's looking for you to take it as seriously as this does should try expanding on the original in an emotionally compelling way, especially one as thematically strong as the first Halloween. And this didn't. Well, with the exception of the big reveal of Laurie and Michael being siblings, which I think is just a hacky plot twist from its execution, its heavy-handed foreshadowing, and the little bearing it had on the story. I can commend that it tries giving Michael a motivation despite the fact that it contradicts everything explored in the original movie. It just did not work here at all. So despite the sibling plotline being a major part of this franchise up until the David Gordon Green trilogy, I just did not care for that reveal, at least the way it was presented here. Now, I know this one has its defenders. The gore is decent at times, the cast is fine, so I get why people do like this. But for me, all I saw this as was just a major step down from its predecessor. Number 9 is Rob Zombie's Halloween, and from here on out, the rest of these movies I like to at least some degree, whether I thought they were just alright, or I thought they were good, or I thought they were great, or whatever. Now, this was only the second ever of these movies I've ever seen. It's the first of them I saw in theaters, and I remember actually liking it and not really understanding the hate behind it. And when I saw it again recently, I still thought it was pretty alright. Now, it's definitely not perfect by any means, don't get me wrong there. Rob Zombie isn't exactly the best when it comes to writing dialogue. There are some fun one-liners here and there, but there can be some pretty cringeworthy moments that hold this back considerably. But I think that ultimately doesn't cause me to dislike this. There's still plenty to enjoy. I think both Scout Taylor Compton and Malcolm McDowell were really solid as Laurie and Dr. Loomis. McDowell especially was just some spot-on casting. And I did like Zombie's visual style. It's actually kind of a shame that his writing doesn't match his directing, because I did find this movie to have some nice visual flair and a tone that was grisly and bleak, but never to the point of outright depressing. And when it comes to Michael just doing his thing, I thought those moments were really well done. Plus, I did appreciate this attempt at trying to give Michael some backstory. Again, even though it contradicts the fact that he's supposed to be evil incarnate with no real other explanation. But I thought it was cool to try exploring why he is the way he is right out of the gate. Now, I don't think it exactly amounted to anything we haven't seen before. It's essentially just a generic storyline about a troubled kid that felt a bit surface level. But unlike Halloween 2, where it's all done in a very corny plot twist, I felt that these moments didn't feel forced or anything like that. So they're still commendable efforts, even if they don't go as deep as I think Zombie hoped they would come off as. But still, I enjoyed this one. I think if the dialogue was polished and the film wound up having a little more to say in terms of that supposedly more humane side of Michael, it could have been a potentially great film. But as it stands, it's still fine. And going right along with that, at number 8 is the sequel, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Again, another one where I didn't quite get all the hate surrounding it. By no means perfect, but I think it still works. Now, if there's one thing I can say about the two Rob Zombie Halloween movies is that if nothing else, they're at least consistent when going from one film to the other. The look, the feel, the performances, the visuals, it's not jarring going from one to the other. So I find it hard to believe your opinion of one isn't going to be too far off from your opinion of the other. And as for me, since I liked the first one for what it was, I also was totally fine with this. And the reason I'd rank this a little higher is because I did think it was a little more visceral than the original. The standoffs between Laurie and our other protagonists against Michael felt a little more heightened here, and that sense of dread is actually improved upon a bit. It's not outright one of the creepiest experiences out there or anything, but it's conveyed just a bit better here in my opinion. Plus, I found the directions they took both Loomis and Laurie intriguing. With Loomis, we explore things like people's fascinations with serial killers and the exploitation that comes with that. It might make him considerably more unlikable here, but I thought Malcolm McDowell did a great job with him. And I thought Scout Taylor Compton was even better here than the first, as we actually see her process this news of her being Michael's sister. That's something we never actually saw in any of the other movies that went with the sibling storyline, which is why I think I was more fine with it here. So I thought the way it was handled, where she's trying to keep it all together while still trying to escape Michael, it made for some great character development and an interesting arc for her. Now again, with that, you still have some issues, like Zombie's screenplay never going quite as deep as he could have gone with some of the more complex topics, and some of that dialogue is still a bit crunchy, but I still think the good outweighs the bad, and this is still a solid enough time. Number 7, the newest film, Halloween Ends, and while it's not exactly the most ideal way to end this newest trilogy, I still think there's more that I appreciated than I disliked. Though I'd say, while this entire franchise can be divisive in general among fans, this is probably going to be one of the most divisive, considering it shifts gears to focus on a brand new character years after the events of 2018 and Kills, and has a whole lot to set up, despite the fact that it's the end of a trilogy. So it just makes the whole thing feel a bit clunky, but for what it was, I still enjoyed it. I honestly like Corey Cunningham, and I like the themes that were explored with him, how evil doesn't truly die, it just takes shape. And I thought Rowan Campbell was great, as was Jamie Lee Curtis. I also appreciated the reflective tone this took, downplaying a lot of the horror elements. This is the first time we've actually explored the aftermath of a slasher spree, which you don't often see in a franchise. It makes this feel a bit more like an epilogue in some ways. I thought that was a really ambitious move on David Gordon Green's part. But again, it's still jarring to see all that at the end of a trilogy that's meant to wrap up a 40-year-old franchise, at least for now. I do think even if just some of these elements were at least introduced in one of the other two movies, it would have gone a long way, as this still does have the feeling of being a bit removed from the other two. But I think once you get over that jarring shift, it still works, and whenever they do touch upon the horror elements, those were also solid, even if not the most prevalent tone throughout the film. Doesn't mean the movie's perfect though. There are some logic issues I had involving Corey's involvement with Laurie and her granddaughter, as well as the way Michael's place in the story is explained, and while the endpoint is satisfying, the third act as a whole could have been better. There are a couple of storylines that fizzle out when getting to this final stretch, and the whole thing just felt a tad rushed. So while I still think the good outweighed the bad, it was still a bumpy ride. Number 6, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, the red-headed stepchild of the Halloween franchise, as it's the only one to not focus on Michael Myers, with the original idea being that this was going to turn into an anthology series centered around different stories taking place on Halloween. And obviously that didn't happen, but in some ways it's kind of a shame, as I would have liked to have seen all the different subgenres of horror this could have explored. Unlike all the other movies in this franchise, this is more of a sci-fi horror, utilizing a lot of schlocky B-movie elements you'd see out of, say, cheesy monster movies from the 80s. And while it can certainly feel dated, I thought it was a lot of fun. It's not particularly scary, but it can be pretty brutal at times, with the targets of this grand conspiracy involving jack-o'-lantern masks being little children instead of the usual teenagers. And it probably has one of the biggest downer endings in the entire Halloween franchise, which I won't spoil if you haven't seen it. And while it doesn't contain any of the iconic characters as the rest of the series does, I thought Tom Atkins as our protagonist, Dr. Dan, is solid here, as is Dan O'Herlihy as the film's sadistic villain. Not everything works about it, including this extensive use of this one jingle that's used so many times throughout the film that it becomes straight up aggravating, and it can feel tonally uneven in some areas, but I like the mystery aspect at the core of it, mixed with its sci-fi elements. And while it's now not universally loved or anything, it has gained a reputation as a standalone cult film, with a loyal following, and I find myself in that camp of enjoying it. I'm actually kind of upset it only took me till this year to finally watch it. At number 5, Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, which, after the middling Halloween 2 and then Season of the Witch being about a totally different storyline, this is a nice return to form for Michael Myers in what kicks off the Thorn trilogy and also sees the return of Dr. Loomis. It's not exactly one of the creepiest of these movies, and as much as I like it, I don't think it fully recaptures the atmosphere of the original, especially given the mask Michael uses here is pretty bad, but I still think this one's a lot of fun, and probably just one of the most fun entries in the entire franchise. This introduces us to Jamie Lloyd and Rachel, who are both very compelling protagonists, with Rachel in particular, I think, being one of the better protagonists overall within the series. I feel like she's someone who's not actually talked about enough, to be honest. Though, while there are some cases of wooden dialogue here and there, making it not always the smoothest experience, what makes up for that is the fact that it goes all in on that mindless slasher fun. The kills can feel a little over the top at times, especially considering the lengths Michael goes to here to get our protagonists, but there's also this nice sense to the film that it's kind of aware of how ridiculous certain elements can be, and it just fully embraces them. So that made me really enjoy this. It's unfortunately a shame the Thorn trilogy never amounted to anything truly compelling, considering where things head for the next two movies, but at least this was a strong first entry that you can still watch on its own and really appreciate. Number 4, Halloween Kills. Now, this one's actually grown on me, as initially I was ready to stick this a lot lower on this list, but upon my most recent rewatch, I actually found myself coming around to it. Now, let's be clear, this is still a huge step down from the refreshingly great Halloween 2018, with some odd character decisions, particularly when it comes to any of the scenes in the hospital, as well as some really poor dialogue. But the thing that really saves this for me is that it also delivers on the thing that people most enjoy seeing when it comes to a Halloween movie, and that's Michael Myers going on an absolute rampage. This is a completely bloody, sometimes over-the-top experience that sees Michael going all out. And as I've said about previous entries, if that's all you really care about when it comes to the Halloween movies, then you won't be disappointed. When I mentioned earlier about how Halloween 2, how that felt like it lacked a lot of the fun of seeing Michael going on a rampage through town, I think this handled that aspect a lot better. Now, with that, it can be fairly one note, as most of the film involves Michael just going on a killing spree through town, and a now adult Tommy Doyle rallies an angry mob for an hour and a half to go after him, and I can see how people can grow tired of all these variations of those sort of scenes very quickly. It has a number of repetitive beats, and the amount of times everyone shouts "Evil dies tonight" had to have been one of the most aggravating things. And because of that, some of that solid character development that was explored in 2018 falls to the wayside here. So I get where the immense dislike comes from. But for me, it still maintains a little bit of that dark humor from 2018, and its more ridiculous elements give it a fun, almost camp edge to it that I can appreciate. So again, I wound up liking it even more on the most recent time I watched it because of those elements. Like most of the movies on this list, it's a film that's far from perfect, and I get why people really don't care for it, but it's so over the top that I like it for what it is. At number 3, Halloween H2o, 20 Years Later, which essentially works more like Halloween by way of Scream, especially due to Kevin Williamson being involved in a number of areas of production. The vibe can certainly feel similar to other movies involving Williamson, especially with its bright, bleedy 90s aesthetic at times. So because of that, pretty much like nearly every other movie on this list, it doesn't fully recapture that same eerie atmosphere as John Carpenter's original, and it can feel a touch inconsistent here and there in terms of tone. But when it works, it's a fun thrill ride, though one that also has some really solid character development. In fact, this has one of the better character arcs for Laurie in general. It covers some similar ground as 2018, where Laurie's still dealing with the trauma of that initial encounter, though here it's done in a much more grounded way, with a pretty nuanced exploration of her family life as well. I do think that because it isn't quite as atmospheric, it does lead to the occasional pacing issue here and there, but the overall sense of dread is still there for the most part, and I also appreciated how this had one of the more satisfying endings of all these movies, at least until Resurrection undid it. But still, on its own, it's still a solid slasher and an enjoyable time. Our runner-up is Halloween 2018, which kicked off the trend we now know as the requel, and because of that, it is the closest to recapturing that atmosphere-heavy feel of the original, giving us a refreshing back-to-basics approach after so many alternate timelines, reboots, and convoluted additions to the lore. As I said earlier, this and H2O do cover some of the same ground, where we see Laurie struggle with the trauma of the initial encounter all those years ago. Though this time it's without the sibling story intact, and with Laurie being considerably more badass here. Like, this is Laurie more by way of Ellen Ripley, and while it might feel a bit over the top at times, I thoroughly enjoyed her arc here, even if the whole broken family subplot between her and her daughter might feel like territory we've treaded before. I found this to be thoroughly engaging, and one of the only entries in this franchise to be anything close to scary. But, surprisingly, it's also pretty funny, thanks to David Gordon Green and Danny McBride's screenplay adding in a lot of fun, dark humor that would help break up the tension. I know that humor isn't something everyone's necessarily the biggest fan of, they find it a bit distracting, but I thought it offered a refreshing balance to some of the more brutal moments. To me, it's easily the best of all the sequels in any timeline. It's definitely influential in the trend that it's set, and I find it to be an absolute blast each time I watch it. But in first place, of course, could it have been anything else? The one that started it all, 1978's Halloween, still one of the greatest and most iconic horror movies of all time. Having laid the groundwork for the slasher genre and many tropes associated with it, what's interesting about this film is that it doesn't exactly operate the same way many of the films it inspired does. With it working on such a low budget, John Carpenter went for a less is more approach. Most of the scares rely on atmosphere, and the film doesn't exactly have this huge body count. In fact, while Michael Myers is known for being this large, hulking figure who hacks people to death with a butcher knife, that exact style of attack only happens once here, in the opening scene. So this isn't the bloody gore fest that's become a common trait of all the slashers this inspired. Instead, Carpenter's direction and his score are where a lot of the scares come from. The way he plays around with shot compositions, sometimes with Michael only being this faint presence in the background, that's where this truly shines. Plus, the way he utilizes that iconic score, it immediately signals that something bad's about to happen, and while it's on the nose, it doesn't come off as obnoxious. And despite its simplistic approach, it's also a thematically strong movie, with this being the examination of pure evil through our iconic antagonist in Michael Myers, who's arguably more terrifying for his lack of rhyme or reason. Add to that a pair of memorable protagonists in Dr. Loomis and Laurie Strode, not only do you have a classic horror movie, but my #1 favorite of all the Halloween movies. But let me know, what's your ranking of the Halloween movies? Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.